what also happened, so yeah, that was just a little, that was kind of interesting, and you'll see why the reason I wanted to show it, besides just adding some humor, starting out with some of that. Community members, when the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed, that passed in February of 2019. They also got invited then to the United Nations on Earth Day in April of 2019 to speak about the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And also in June of 2019, I was like somewhere with friends, we were socializing, and all of a sudden my phone started blowing up and everyone's like, oh my God, did you just see on Jeopardy? The Lake Erie Bill of Rights was a clue on Jeopardy. And so the reason this is important is because in just 2 years' time, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights has really entered pop culture. I mean, when it passed, it was interesting. CNN came out, Mother Jones did a story, New York Times did a story. We got calls from people in Europe, Le Monde in France did a story, an Italian publication. And so why it's so important is because we know that changing minds and culture goes hand in hand with changing the law. And a lot of times culture changes first and then the laws should follow, because if we think about it, our laws should reflect our values, right? Unfortunately, a lot of times what we see when it's not grassroots driven, when the power structure is changing the law, they write or change the law, and culture is supposed to conform just because it's the law. So how does culture change? I guess, how do cultural norms change? I don't know if anyone wants to share their ideas about that, maybe in chat. I wish we had more time and we could make this a lot more interactive, because I'm curious what, all of you think, how does culture change? One of the things we talk about, CELDF, we do well, we did before COVID, it was a 1.5-day democracy school, and we kind of look at the whole system and structure of where we're at. We now have converted this to a virtual school, and it's 8 hours, 8+ hours. We do it in 4 modules. But one of the things we talk about in our first module is, where are we? Where do we find ourselves? Because it's really critical that we understand what the actual problem is before we can actually start to think about correcting it or making change, positive change that we want. And so one of the things we've come up with is looking at the environmental laws and system in this country. And after 50 years, after the adoption of what we consider landmark federal environmental laws by almost every major environmental statistic, things are worse now than before those laws were passed. We've kind of run out of options. So taking it back to Toledo and their story, how did this begin there? It was 2014. Some of you may remember, some of you probably didn't even know, but there was this water crisis that happened. The people in Toledo woke up on the morning of August 3rd to all kinds of warnings on the news, TV, radio, internet. And it wasn't just to not drink the water. Some of us have had in our communities boil alerts, things like that. This was a do not touch the water, don't bathe in it. So in other words, don't do dishes, don't do laundry, because it could make you sick to touch the water. FEMA was brought in. These are just some pictures from that day. You can see people had to wait in long lines. The shelves were cleared out. How did this affect? We talk about it as a social justice issue. I mean, Toledo is an urban center, and some of the poorer communities there obviously didn't have the same options as the people in the suburbs that were wealthier. They could drive, they were driving out over 100 miles to get water. And that wasn't an option for all the residents there. What they saw was businesses closed down, restaurants obviously had to shut down, retail establishments shut down. Even the hospital in the city was only taking the most dire emergency cases. So they really understood in those 3 days what it was like for a community to not have a water supply. Just to show you, this is satellite image, because this problem, you can see the algae there. This is from NOAA, so it's a government entity taking the satellite image, and you can see the water intake. And what happened is the algae with the cyanobacteria and the microsystems, which are toxic, got into the water supply there. And this is an image from 2014. Now, that wasn't the first time they'd had algae in Lake Erie. So there had been studies, the government, everyone knew that this was a problem. They know what it's being caused by. And just to show you, here's an image from 2019, taken August 2019. You can see it's no better. So here's 2014, here's 2019. What it shows 6 years later, that nothing's really changed. You would have thought that there should have been major changes made. If you listen to the government and the Environmental Protection Agency, there's all kinds of things, right, that they're doing. But the people of Toledo, obviously living in this, realize that's not true. So back to our problem, and let's broaden it out outside of Toledo, just to prove my point that things are worse, because a lot of times people don't necessarily believe it. They'll say things to me like, I'm from Cleveland, and they'll say, well, didn't the Cuyahoga River catch on fire there? And they're like, that doesn't happen anymore. And I'm like, well, if that's your standard of environmental protection, those are pretty low standards. In the United States alone, and some of these statistics that I've put on here are probably already, outdated. They're 5, 6 years old, probably, some of them. But you can read them about the forests being cut. The 80,000 industrial chemicals are currently in use, with more than 700 found in every human body, and more than 1,800 new chemicals introduced annually. Approximately 40% of the lakes in this country can't be fished in. There's no aquatic life or good for swimming. The World Health Organization estimates that 3.575 million people die from water-related diseases a year. So again, back to, our environmental protection laws really protecting the environment? Now, one of the problems, that we look at, and I talk about this a lot, is I talk about, they hijack our language, right? And we have to in our heads, because to me, rights of nature is this huge paradigm shift that not only has to take place in the law, but I mentioned culture, and we have to change in our own minds the way we talk about things, the way we view things in the world. And so here in Northwest Ohio, it's a lot of the production, the big farming industry that is causing a lot of the algae problem. And we call them animal farms. Well, they're not really. I mean, these are some photos taken from these. They call them CAFOs in the regulatory world, but they're really animal factories. I mean, to me, a farm is where the animals are out and they're grazing and they're eating grass. These chickens they never even set foot on the ground. And so let's call it what it is. It's a factory. It's an animal factory. They do this no matter what the industry. So oil and gas industry will call their waste brine. And brine sounds so benign, right? It sounds like something you might marinate your turkey in, when it's really highly radioactive and toxic. We talk about wind farms or solar farms. Well, that's not really accurate. I mean, you don't plant a seed and all of a sudden a wind turbine pops through. So we have to think about this, because the language that industry puts out there, it gives us a false sense of security and also a severity of the problems that we face. Really quick in this, I don't know if you can see this at the top. I don't know if my thing is, there it is. I just want you to see the headline on this. It says manure from unregulated factory farms fuels Lake Erie's toxic algae blooms. Well, the key in this, I want you to, and this is the headline, is unregulated. Because what do we always hear from industry? That there's too many regulations, right? Well, that's for our benefit, because that's, again, makes us feel that someone's looking out for us and the environment, that we're being protected. What we don't really understand is that the regulations are being written by the very industries. And so it's kind of a self-regulation, because they're considered the experts in whatever the industry is. And just to be clear, this works the same whether it's agriculture, whether it's oil and gas, whether it's, you know, mining of some sort, it doesn't matter. It works the same. And those regulations give us this false sense again of security, that everything is being taken care of. We call this, when we teach the school, we call it the regulatory fallacy. Trying to get that, I can't really get it out of the way. The regulatory fallacy. And so when we put limits on the harm, we call that regulation. But what regulation means is that we allow the harm to happen, but in a regulated manner. So think of regulation versus prohibiting. Those are two different things. And then a regulation, they apply, right? The corporation or the industry will apply to the state or the government for a permit. And think about that word, it's permit. So once the governmental agency issues the permit, it permits the harm to be legally done. And so, you know, this whole idea of regulation is different than rights. You can't regulate rights. One of the things that people don't understand too, you know, it's a lot of times we get stuck in this regulatory system that's been set up because it's not our fault. It's where we get funneled to go. It's what we're taught to do. And the regulatory hearings, I don't know how many on this webinar have been at a regulatory hearing, but they pretty much operate all the same. And you're allowed a certain amount of time usually to talk. And it's usually just something that is on the checklist for what the industry has to do to get the permit. So like they'll have a checklist of things, and one might be to hold a regulatory hearing. And so they have to do that. It doesn't mean that your comments actually have to go anywhere or anything is done with those comments. And they're almost always approved. It's very rarely that they get denied. It's actually the work that CELDF started doing over 25 years ago. And this is this, again, where we're taught, and this is environmental law, and you appeal the permit application. If something is coming to your community that you don't want, you're told to appeal that permit that's been issued, and you go to court. And then we would search through tons and tons of, you know, parts of pages of this permit application. And maybe we'd find that they didn't hold a public hearing, or that they didn't conduct a wetland study, or, you know, something like that, and take it to court. And the court would say, oh, they're right. You have to, you know, pull that permit, reject it. It's no longer valid. Well, all they would do then is reapply. We had now found all the things that were wrong with the permit application, and then it would get issued. And the corporate lawyers obviously made more money. It appeared as a win for us. And so it looked like we were doing good work, but the community then wound up getting the harm it didn't want it, and the environment got trashed. So, you know, this is when we changed our whole focus from regulations to rights and started looking at this as a rights-based issue instead of playing in the regulatory playground that was set up for us. So back to Toledo. So from 2014 to 2016, the people of Toledo tried to work the system as it is. They tried to protect Lake Erie. They went to their elected officials. The only help they got there was to devote more tax dollars to testing of the water and maybe doing that sooner. They implemented voluntary classes. They were all voluntary to farmers on how to apply fertilizers. And they also said, we'll test the beaches daily, the water, and we'll post signs if it's safe to go in or not. And it's like, well, how sad is that? I mean, we should be able to swim in the water every day. This was just another group in the area besides the group that worked on the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. It was called Advocates for a Clean Lake Erie. And they kind of went back and added up all the dollars that the state had put into cleaning up Lake Erie and realized that it was almost $500 million between 2014 and I think this went through 2019 to clean up Lake Erie. And it's actually done nothing. I mean, we don't need more studies. We know what's causing the problem. They actually put into place, they wanted the city to pay for upgrading the water treatment plant, which of course they did. So it wasn't the polluter who had to pay to upgrade the water treatment plant. It was the ratepayers, the people, the people in Toledo in higher water bills. They said, well, we'll test more often. These are the kind of responses, right, to the problem that people got going to the government. We'll test more often, and then we'll know whether we need to add more chemicals, more chlorine to the water to prevent the water crisis from happening again. Well, the people realize that's not an answer. That's not solving the problem. It's not helping the lake. And the way this works, you just see the whole cycle happening again. Are we in a decade going to realize that all this chlorine and other chemicals we're adding is causing other problems to the lake and both the people? So we think we live in a democracy, right? Maybe a lot of you on this webinar believe we do. Maybe some of you don't. From my personal experience, I would say that we live in an illusion of democracy. And what I would like is for us to actually try to govern as a real democracy by the people once and just see what happens. I don't think we've ever had that. And that's what part of what the people in Toledo tried to do with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. You have to ask yourselves, are we the decision makers in our communities? Really? And if the answer is no, then who is making the laws and for whose benefit? And I know in Ohio, we have the best General Assembly that big ag and big oil money can buy. I'm pretty sure that's how it works in New York or any other state, although the General Assemblies may be bought off by different industries, depending on what resources you have there. But it pretty much works the same. And as I stated earlier, we a lot of times get stuck in what we call the regulatory fallacy. Well, to me, that's only one place where we get stuck. Another is what I call here, I've made this name up myself, but I just call it, it's the law syndrome. Because we hear that so much when we tried to pass the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, or in my community, we had rights of nature in the Bill of Rights we passed. And, people, well, you can't do that because it's against the law. And one of the things too, we're in an election cycle, obviously a very critical one right now. And people get so concerned about, our right to vote, which they should be, but they don't always think about, well, what's on the ballot? Right? Who those choices we have on the ballot, who decided those for us? And to me, this is why local lawmaking is so important. In local communities, it's where we live. That has the greatest impact on our day-to-day lives. The health of Lake Erie as our drinking water source is critical. And it's what the residents in Toledo realized because of that water crisis in 2014. So this idea of who's making the law and who's violating the law. So when the people of Toledo put that Lake Erie Bill of Rights in place, the polluters at that point would be the ones who are violating the law. Instead of currently, when we try to protect our communities and there's laws on the books that prevent us, they say, well, you can't do it because you're in violation of the law. Now, a lot of people will say to me at this point, they'll go, but we already have laws on the books that are supposed to protect water. We have the Clean Water Act. We have the Clean Air Act. We have all these laws on the books that are there to protect the environment. And that group I mentioned earlier who looked at how much money is spent, they actually filed a lawsuit against the state of Ohio for not upholding the Clean Water Act. And I just pulled some of these excerpts from the judge. This is the judge's comments in that case. And you can see by reading them that even he is admitting that this isn't working. This system isn't working. So it's not just, a few crazy people, right, in Toledo saying this. It's CELDF. Here's a judge who's got a case in front of him by a group trying to make the state of Ohio enforce the Clean Water Act. And he says that the state and the EPA, their longstanding persistent reluctance and on occasion refusal to comply with the Clean Water Act is polluting and destroying Lake Erie and poisoning hundreds of thousands of people living in Toledo in the process. He also warned about Lake Erie's future. He says, especially if Ohio continues to rely on its past utterly failed, wastefully, costly efforts to secure voluntary compliance from those who want to remain free from statutory or regulatory restraint, there is quite simply no reason whatsoever to believe that continued exhortation without more will work or have any useful effect. And he finally says that, he calls it their phony efforts, the Ohio Environmental Protection Agencies, to protect Lake Erie. And he calls it a placebo. And that it won't work. So to me, the reason I find that so interesting is just because this is a federal judge saying this about the very laws that we believe are there to protect us and nature. And this is just something I pulled out. This was a response we had in one of our briefs back to the court. And we said, with the health of hundreds of thousands of humans and the lives of countless non-humans at stake, more than a placebo is needed. We need fast-acting and truly effective medicine. And enforcing the Lake Erie Bill of Rights would provide that kind of medicine. Back to, so what are rights of nature? And we know environmental degradation is advancing around the world. The United Nations has warned us that we're heading towards major planetary catastrophe. There's a growing recognition that we have to fundamentally change our relationship, the relationship between humankind and nature. Oh, it's interesting, this quote, in the briefs in the case against the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, the state of Ohio, in several places, and even when they did oral arguments, claimed to own Lake Erie. So it's this ownership idea that nature is something there to be owned. So we have to make this fundamental shift in our minds, and that means recognizing our dependence on nature and respecting our need to live in harmony with the natural world. So this would mean securing the highest legal protections and placing the highest societal value on nature through the recognition of rights. And that's kind of where the people of Toledo came. They didn't start out there, but then they came to realize after that water crisis that this is indeed a question of rights. Do we have a right to a livable climate? Do we have the right to clean air and water? And that ties into, do we actually have the right to local self-governance? We claim to be a self-governing people, but are we truly? And our whole culture and system is based on rights. And I want to bring this up because Indigenous cultures around the world obviously don't have the same cultural views that we do or that we've been taught in our culture. They don't put humans and human rights above nature. They understand that humans are part of nature, not separated from it. And they don't view nature as something that needs to be managed by humans. And even when you think about our own government structure, we have a Bureau of Land Management. We have a department maybe of forest management, right? Our legal system and culture sees our relationship with nature as hierarchical instead of interconnected. So when you think of it from an Indigenous culture perspective, they wouldn't understand even why you would need a law to give nature rights. They understand that if you're harming nature, you're harming yourself. So it makes no sense. Why would you need a law to prevent someone from putting poison in the river that's your drinking water source? You'd be poisoning yourself. That makes no sense. So I'm only bringing that up to try and, that paradigm shift in our head so that we in our culture, can envision something different than what we've been taught. So one of the things, we talk about at CELDF is, what's a solution here? And we talk about community rights tied in with rights of nature because the community, nature is part of that larger community. We are part of that community, but so is nature, the whole environment around us. It's interesting, when I was working on my issue in my community in Broadview Heights, there was a big thing going on at the time in Ohio about fracking in the parks. And everyone is up in arms, all the activists, about you can't frack in the park. And I remember contacting a couple of my, the representative state reps that I knew, and I said, wait a minute, because they're supporting this effort. And I said, if fracking is too bad to do in the park, why isn't it too bad to do and too dangerous to do in my backyard or in my community? So again, it's that separation, right? That parks are where we go to be in nature, when in reality, nature is all around us. And so there's all these little, you know, you kind of in your head you have to constantly be thinking about this. So at CELDF, you know, we talk about past movements. We look at that, obviously, not obviously that they were all perfect or anything, but it's an example to look at. And part of what they had to do is reveal how the current structure of law strips us of our basic democratic rights, and then building a movement focused on changing that structure. So just stopping, we talk about an individual harm, to give an example, isn't changing the structure or shifting the power of decision-making. So for example, we see a lot of communities working on trying to stop a pipeline, right, in their, you know, or maybe say a single dump or a single factory farm. When they do that, not saying that it's good, bad, I'm not making any judgment issue, but we have to realize that they're not attacking the underlying systemic problem of how laws are passed and for whose benefit. And so again, by Toledo, I always talk about Toledo as being like this perfect storm of everything that happened there. And because they had that water crisis, they've realized this. They tried to work through the system. They knew what it was like to not have water for 3 days, and that really influenced their actions. So and we have tons of communities. I mean, there's over 200 throughout the United States, plus there's also international communities working on rights of nature laws and community rights, and it's all trying to level the playing field. And my goal here is just to give you a brief overview of why we need this movement. And a movement is much harder, right, than focusing on one single issue. But if we could all work together to change the system itself, it would help us all, no matter what our single issue is. And this is what corporations do. You know, they work to change the system. Of course, I realize they have a much easier time because they have so much money. And just to kind of go back to give you a quick timeline of what happened with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and in Toledo. Now it was 2 years. So you'll see when that passed, it was 2019. They actually worked, the water crisis was 2014. So 14 to 16, they worked within the system, got nowhere. And in 2016 is when they contacted us and said, hey, you know, can we maybe do something here with rights of nature? And that's what we did. We worked with the community to draft the language. And then they went out for 2 years and collected signatures. They have that ability in Ohio. I know New York doesn't have the right to initiative, but there's other ways to do this. But they did that for 2 years. And then as soon as they got enough signatures, they filed it. And then the Board of Elections voted to keep them off the ballot. So they had another challenge. Went to court. We have to fight that. Then once they finally got the okay to go on the ballot, which that was another long story, there was a protest filed by a single individual, had to go back to court again. Then when they finally did get on the ballot and there was a campaign, you heard in the video from the Daily Show, there was a huge anti-Lake Erie Bill of Rights campaign. That was funded, we didn't find out until after the campaign, by BP, and they spent over $300,000, and the community group only spent $6,000. So this was a real David and Goliath effort, but they won, and they won with 60% of the vote. And again, I believe that was because the people of Toledo, it wasn't just talking about losing their water, like what could happen in the future, they actually experienced it. And so even though the anti-people tried to scare the people with, it's going to cost jobs, the city of Toledo will become a ghost town, they knew that wasn't true because they knew without water, the community was nothing, and that they lost jobs and everything closed down when you don't have water. So picking up the timeline, once it passed, within 12 hours of it passing, a large corporate farm filed a lawsuit against the city of Toledo to have the law overturned. A federal judge in that case, the state of Ohio immediately wanted to get into the case. So they filed a motion to intervene to become a party. And the judge granted them their motion. At the same time, the residents in the city of Toledo, because they aren't part of the case because the farm sued the city of Toledo. And what you have to understand is the city of Toledo did not back this law, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. It was strictly put forward by the people. The people proposed it, the people put it on the ballot, and the people voted for it. So it wasn't like their council voted for this, but they're the ones now defending it. And so the people wanted to also intervene and be a party to the lawsuit, but that same judge, he denied the people in Lake Erie from entering the lawsuit as a party. In June, there's 3 Toledo residents who filed a lawsuit, pro se means without a lawyer, against the state of Ohio, because they wanted to show people what it was like, what the Lake Erie Bill of Rights and law, a rights of nature law, how it could actually be used. And we realized, because a lot of this is about setting an example, showing people what it looks like. The only reason I'm putting this up is because I want to show you how fierce the opposition is. Libor passed in February, and then this happened in about April of 2019, April or beginning of May. The Chamber of Commerce, we found out after the fact again, drafted language that is actually a preemption of rights of nature. They handed it to one of our legislators and had this inserted into a budget bill the day before the vote was taken. So that means there was no public debate on it, no public discussion. There wasn't even debate within the legislature. Most of the legislators we spoke to didn't even know it was inserted into the bill. And when you see the language here, they're closing the court, so nature or any ecosystem does not have standing to participate in or bring an action in a court of common pleas. No person can represent nature or an ecosystem can get into the court. What this is basically saying is they don't want the Lake Erie Bill of Rights repeated in any other community in Ohio. We're gonna squash this. Right now, we're gonna put that genie back in the bottle. We don't want any more attempts at this. Now, we actually did have oral arguments in January of this year in federal court, and it was the first time in history that rights of an ecosystem were argued for over 90 minutes in federal court. In the end, the next month, the judge ruled in favor of the corporate farm and invalidated the law and the Lake Erie's rights. The pro se lawsuit, just so you know, that's still going on. So that's, there's a little tiny hope, but we knew that because movements aren't always linear, right? If you look at past movements for change, there's some progress, maybe a step made forward, and then there might be 2 steps back, and then maybe another step forward, and then maybe 3 steps back. So, we weren't surprised by any of this. But one of the questions people ask, why is this idea so threatening to the current system? Why is there so much opposition to rights of nature? Because when you explain it to people, they all say, well, this makes perfect sense. Of course we need this. Well, you have to think, because rights of nature is about actually expanding rights. And whenever you expand rights, there's a power shift that takes place. So if we look back just in history, one example, when only white men with property could vote, they held all the power to make all the decisions, right? And make all the laws. And so once that got expanded to say white men without property, there's now more people that are involved in making those decisions. So it's a shift of power. And so this is what actually the big fight is about. When you look at the courts here, you know, the word corporation isn't found anywhere in our Constitution. So how did corporations get these rights? Well, they were found, right, by judges. And it was invented by Supreme Court rulings. So when we bring these cases and these laws are passed, what they did in Toledo and what the people did, you know, not that we're going to count on judges, because I think the judges, the court system is actually going to be the last. It's going to be pressure has to come from the people and from pushing from many different places. So the reason I just put this headline in here, this is a headline that came out in the Toledo Blade after the court ruling. And I just think it's so interesting because I want everybody to read headlines differently too. This is the Attorney General Yost. He says, let's save the lake legally after the Lake Erie Bill of Rights is invalidated. And to me, that's so interesting because the state has had the ability to protect the lake all along legally. And so why aren't you, is the question. I'm going to skip that. I want to talk about this a little bit with civil disobedience. You know, and what is civil disobedience? I mean, it's people disobeying a law because they believe the law is unfair or unjust. So to me, whenever any community, the people of Toledo or any community who attempts rights of nature laws from here on out, I mean, you have to look at that. This is actually, by proposing it, that is civil disobedience. But it doesn't, you know, it kind of has this negative connotation, right? But it shouldn't. Because when we look at past movements, that's what they had to do. And as long as we just accept polluted water, the toxic air, increasing cancer rates, the climate crisis, nothing's going to change. We have to stop accepting the system as it is and what it says we're allowed to do. And we have to instead start asserting, and it's asserting our rights to self-govern and to actually protect our communities and nature from the harm. You know, I mean, I look at this, I put these photos up just because to me, the visuals are so on target. The law at the time, I mean, when you look at this was photo, the law was on the side of the people behind those at the lunch counter, not those sitting at that lunch counter. So the ones pouring the food on them and all that, that's who the law was protecting at the time. You know, so it makes perfect sense that the opposition is going to resist and fight because they don't want to give up the power. You know, we in our minds a lot of times look at it as that individual environmental harm that might be happening, and we don't look at it about shifts in power, but it actually is. And that's the difference between a movement and a moment. It's about shifting the power, and it doesn't ever end. That's another mistake we make. You know, we think we won at some point and we kind of take a sigh of relief and go, I can go back to my life as normal now. Well, the shifts in power are constant. If you do happen to gain a little bit, as we see with the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, the people bypassing that gained some, they're not going to just be happy with that and say, oh yeah, you were right, we were wrong. They're going to fight to get the power back. This is just a few because I think I like to point this out. I want to show some hope here as well, right? I don't want this to all be negative, but sometimes when we're in the midst of a movement for change, it's difficult to see the progress that it's making. And so some people get discouraged about the news out of Toledo, you know, when they hear about the lawsuit. But in a short amount of time, you can see how this movement is progressing. I mean, I realize I think we need to speed it up, but I think, you know, what nature is doing and what we're seeing happening in all different parts of the world, hopefully will speed this up as well. We can't control everything, right? But in 2006 was the first rights of nature law that was passed, and it was in a community we helped in Tamaqua Borough. It's a very small community, Pennsylvania. and they put rights of nature into law there. And in 2008, 2 years later, Ecuador happened to come across this law. And so we were only a small part, but we helped. They were redoing their constitution at the time and gave some input into putting rights of nature into their constitution. And they've actually used it. There's been a few lawsuits now in Ecuador that have used the rights of nature there. And one of them in 2011, the lawsuit actually in the court ruled in favor of the Vilcabamba River there. And so we see it expanding 2010 in Bolivia, 2012 in India, 2016, the Ho-Chunk Nation here, New Zealand in 2017, Colombia, and then 2019, the Lake Erie Bill of Rights. And this is still continuing. And the big rights of nature timeline that we've put together, and actually there's a researcher we were working with in the Netherlands, he's put together all the different laws that have been proposed. And I'm hoping that's going to be made public within the next month, because that's really interesting to look at. But it's all of these together, and it is all moving forward. So I don't want anyone to be discouraged or think that you shouldn't do it. It's like, it's all the more reason why more communities should do it. And this is, I put this up, this is Hattie in Youngstown. Hattie is a great lady. These folks in Youngstown, before the Lake Erie Bill of Rights passed, they tried 8 times to pass their Water Protection Bill of Rights. And one time they tried a Fair and Free Election Bill of Rights. I mean, they went up against all the big power brokers there, the oil and gas industry, their city electeds were against them, and even the Democratic Party. And they didn't win in 8 attempts. In the traditional sense, they didn't win. But what they did is they helped lay the groundwork for the Lake Erie Bill of Rights, just like the other 40 plus attempts in Ohio that went before Toledo, because there were court cases that happened and there was publicity that went on. And so there was a shifting in the way of thinking. And so that's all very important. I was really fortunate in this past summer. It was the beginning of August, I believe. I went with Marky Miller from Toledo, and we traveled to Buffalo and Niagara Falls. And because of COVID, we actually got to see the river and the falls up close, because we didn't have to fight mobs of tourists like you normally do in the summer. And this was in Buffalo, and we walked to the pier where Lake Erie meets the Niagara River. And all we could think of, you know, was all the pollution from the animal factories in Northwest Ohio to the toxins being dumped from dredging of industrial harbors in all the places along the coastline. There's a pig iron plant proposed for Ashtabula. It's been permitted, and this is highly polluting, and it's right on the shores of Lake Erie. To the oil and gas brine, radioactive brine that's being spread on turnpikes and highways, and that runs into the Lake Erie watershed, and how this all comes downstream to the Niagara River and the falls. You know, and it made us really stop, and we're like, wow, everything is downstream. And that we all have an obligation and a responsibility to protect nature for those who come after us. Unfortunately, we have a system that views both people and nature as disposable for what we consider economic progress. And I think we all need to reflect on this and fight for change, in my opinion. And so I think I'm just going to end it there. I want to thank you for inviting me today, and I want to open it up for questions and comments, because I learned so much from all of you when I do these. And just so you know, there's 2 documentaries about this work. We the People 2.0 is one, and then Invisible Hand is a film about rights of nature that was just premiered in September. So that's also available, and that's my contact information if you want to reach out to me. Please do.
Thank you so much, Tish. What a great introduction to this idea. Tell me if my audio is a little sketchy, because I heard earlier that it might be. The question that I wanted to ask you to get started is, if we decide to take a rights of nature approach to the Niagara River, I know there's a much broader conversation to be had there, but what's the starting point? What would you suggest are the first steps we should take?
Right. The first steps is because it's a community effort, right? So pressure, like I said, pressure comes from many different places. So a lot of times, like people look at a court case and that might be just one or two, plaintiffs bringing a case. And that's not what, that's one source of pressure that you can put on the system. But the people themselves hold a lot of power. And when we're collectively, we can. And so education to me is important. So you need, because this is such a different idea and concept that most of us aren't aware of, educating your community members about what rights of nature is and how, I mean, obviously the harms, we have a lot of that information to the Niagara River and Niagara Falls. And so you have to educate the community members on that, and then proposing the rights of nature as, what that means and as a solution. Because when you get a whole community behind an effort, that collective effort can put a lot of pressure on electeds and on the system.
Great.
That would be the starting point.
And let me just mention to everyone else, please feel free to pose a question in the Q&A or in the chat, and we'll elevate you panelists so that you can ask the question. So our next question is going to come from Jamie Moore.
Okay, sorry, my webcam doesn't work. But it was really more of a rhetorical question. But it was just kind of a thought that, like, how, even if you don't quote unquote believe in the science behind, I don't know, environmental science or climate change or what have you, like, how the heck is protecting the environment a bad thing? How do you put a negative spin on that? Like I said, it was mostly a rhetorical question.
Right. Yeah. Well, but you bring up a point, because it's like trying to relate these topics to people. So, you meet them where they are, kind of thing. And what I think of is in Broadview Heights, like when I did this, because everybody has different, I guess, what you would call hot button issues, or, and that's part of our problem. We don't think of things, I think, so much as community. That the system has been able to break us apart as a community and to look at us more. And that's a whole bigger conversation about capitalism and, and at our the individual self, right, versus the collective of the whole. And a community, though, and that's what Toledo, why that was so important, that they all know they need water. So whether you're Democrat, Republican, conservative, liberal, whatever, when that community didn't have water for 3 days, it affected them all. So there was no divisions, those labels and divisions that we normally, get so caught up in, those disappeared. And in my community, the drilling that we were fighting urban drilling. And so people realized, so whether they cared about the environment as much, the air, their children, they also realized that property values were affected. So the people normally who maybe don't care so much about the environment, but they care more about economic and their own economic interests, they were touched by that. They realized that if the community got a reputation for being polluted, that that's not good for their property value as well.
Okay, well, the next question is Abdias Bomadi.
Hello, like I would like to say something. Like my camera's not working, but I would say I would like to like make a comparison between like human rights and also like nature right. Because like when I think about it, like I feel like anytime it comes to like something that has to do with rights, it always refer back to like money, like in economics. So like I feel like capitalism, it affects everything. So like when it comes to like human rights, you think about like the stocks, this and that. When it comes to like nature, like rights, this it always refer back to like money. So like anytime you go to like I would say fight for something, you always refer back to like money. So like was so like I feel like what's like the point. I mean, I feel like because like the environment, you should like protect what you need because like we all live in like the environment and Earth. So like if it comes to like get the right or like do the thing that can like protect all like rights and like obviously like to get right for like something that we're doing wrong, that should be like the easiest thing to do why should I like refer back to like money and stuff like that? So like that's how I feel, and that was like the comparison I would like like to make.
Right. I mean, and it's, again, it's our system that we look at nature as property to be, and we also look at human labor that way. I mean, what do corporations need to profit, to make a profit, right? They usually need two things, resources and labor. And so it is very interconnected. And that's why we talk about in community rights about who gets to make the decisions. And so much of our system is set up that, and that's why we talk about community rights, that the people there, when you strip them of their ability to have a say in the decision making, they actually become resource colonies in a way. So when you talk about putting waste, let's say, into another community, so you take from one place and then you're going to dump it in another, but does that community really have a say in that? I always kind of think about what would happen if a community had to deal with, when they make a decision about a project coming in, they had to deal with it from beginning to end. So, we're looking at renewable energy now, and we're claiming that that somehow is the savior, but there's a whole bunch of problems with that. I mean, what about, there's the lithium mining that has to go into for the solar panels, right? For the batteries. Well, does that community, and there's a ton of waste. Where's that waste going to go? The wind turbines, they're now finding, I mean, those are made out of fiberglass, and those blades cannot be recycled. So they don't know what to do with all these that are decommissioned. Where are those blades going? Are they going to be dumped in my community and your community? So and that's just how the whole system is set up. When we keep perpetuating it, we change the face of maybe what the issue is, but we don't change the underlying system. So we don't take that into account. I don't know if that answered your question.
Thank you.
I'll say I did. Thank you.
So speaking of community empowerment and community rights, our next question comes from Kathy Rahill. Kathy is the executive director of Cred for GI, which is the organization that sprang up to resist the Amazon warehouse, the massive facility that was going to be built on Grand Island. So, Kathy.
I think you're on mute, Kathy.
Sorry about that. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
So fascinating talk. Thank you very much. Our challenge has been not only just with the fight with the huge Amazon warehouse here, is really getting our town officials to follow the law, period. Right? So talk about being lawful. And we have just since we were founded, which was early July, found dozens of situations where they have flaunted open meeting laws. They flaunted in New York, the State Environmental Quality Review Act, just so many different things in relationship to development efforts. And when you're, kind of a small coalition representing only about 20,000 residents, you don't have these huge, deep pockets to go after an Article 78 or a lawsuit against them every time they do this. So this is a very fascinating approach because I'm getting to learn that the tit for tat, or trying to, kind of slap them down when they do these illegal things each time, really doesn't matter. They go back to the board and they either change the rules or that type of thing, and just go about their merry way again. So I think the question Dave asked in terms of how do we start this process, we at least have a starting point. We actually represent a little more than 10% of the population here. We're unique in that we're an island. And 10% of the homeowners here. And one of the biggest issues that people had, I would say the top two issues about the Amazon warehouse were environmental, first and foremost, and traffic, because, we live and breathe by these two sets of aging bridges that come on and off our island. So I would like to know, you know, how do you make that transition of kind of just going after your officials for just not even following the laws, you know, regardless of the impact or mitigation that's found from secret reviews, that kind of thing, they still vote to approve things. How do you make that transition to going against this sort of, or creating a whole different concept or way of thinking? I mean, what are some of the education efforts, for example, that we could begin to do outreach within our organization? We're a 501(c) organization, to begin the kind of transition of that thought process overall.
Right. I mean, and there's multiple things, Kathy. I mean, you know, education, I talked about, we do this school, you know, you can set up one of those in your community and try to get people engaged that way. You can show documentaries and films. You can do flyers, obviously, you know, obviously with COVID, it's difficult now, but if we get out of COVID ever, you hold community meetings. And one of the things, you know, we talk about, like, democracy is participatory, and we've gotten so used to, you know, we turn everything over to the electeds and think they're doing it, and we don't pay attention. And, you know, so partially it's our own fault. I mean, because that's what we do. We have to pay attention. We have to, know what's going on. That's how they've gotten away with doing so much. And I guess part of it, you know, in the community, it's interesting because, like, in my community, people started really getting engaged when they learned about the problem, going to meetings. The council hated it because the room was filled every Monday with people and residents there. They don't like to see that, but then they do start to pay attention. And basically, if you get a majority or a certain percentage of the community believing what you do, if they don't do that, you can vote them out of office. I mean, you know, that's something that then will happen. That will just naturally occur. But again, it's bringing this sense of community back, understanding what the issues are in the community, proposing solutions. And I think that's just, we've been so disempowered. We've been so taught to believe that the government is there to take care of us and that they're doing their job and we don't have to pay attention. And that's something that we also have to educate people on, not just the environmental issues, but on what it means to be part of a community and participating in the governance of that community.
Yeah, I think some of the conclusions that we drew out of our recent fights and challenges is the fact that we do need to get people who are like-minded to run for office and be there, because that's where the power structure lies. And then secondly, if we care about what happens to the land around us, we have to find ways to purchase it, because that's where the property rights lie, is with the owner, right? So doing things like in California, they have a land paths organization. I know they have one here locally, doing things to actually purchase important critical tracts of land that we give back to the environment and don't allow to be developed, I think is an important aspect as well. So thank you very much.
Oh, you're welcome. We've also worked with communities with rights of nature easements. So that's another thing in the future, you know, we could talk about or consider that you put on the property.
Okay, Leslie.
Yeah, Tish, thanks a lot. Really getting to the core of some of these issues, which is great to see. I'm curious if it just struck me that I'm wondering if you've encountered any opposition from some of the established, more mainstream environmental voices that are out there. I mean, are there actually people that you would assume would be on your side who feel threatened by this more fundamental change approach that you're creating?
You're not going to make me name names, I hope.
Yes.
Yeah. Yes, it's true. Well, you know what I tell people, we have ran into a lot of opposition from environmental groups. And you know what I tell people, it's not necessarily their fault either. I mean, I know they could change, but it's the whole system that's corporatized. We've corporatized everything, right? And so we've corporatized activism as well. And it's this whole big system of, you know, how are they funded? right? They're funded by big corporate, usually foundations and things like that. And so they get money, let's say, to fight fracking one year. And so, you know, but they can't rock the boat too much. Don't challenge the system, because then they'll lose that funding, right? So they do certain things, but then maybe they lose it anyway. And so now they don't follow anything through to the end. So now they're going to get funding to fight some other project. So you go back to them as a community group and say, hey, well, can you help us? And they're like, well, now we don't have funding for that anymore. You know, and so this whole thing, this idea, people believe either their electeds are protecting them, these protection agencies are protecting them, and then they think there's these NGOs and these groups out there that are protecting them. And they're really not, because they've been corporatized as well. And yes, we had many of them tell us that you can't do that. That's illegal and unconstitutional. We had students at Bowling Green University a few years ago propose a right to a livable climate bill of rights. And it was actually the Ohio Sierra Club and Sierra Club lawyers that were coming out and telling the community, no, that's illegal and unconstitutional. You can't pass that kind of law. You know, so, but again, I don't think it's the individual members of these groups or anything, because they just think that they're there to protect the environment, just like they think the Environmental Protection Agency is there to protect the environment.
Mhm.
So.
Yeah, I guess you don't need me telling you this, but keep it up. It's good work. Thanks.
Thanks. You have to be tough to do this work and fight the system. Let me tell you, you can't have thin skin.
Tish, thank you so much for being here and sharing your experience and insights. And you've described some of the legal barriers that have prevented implementation of change in Ohio. And you've talked about opposition both from the state of Ohio and its lawyers, as well as lawyers representing other established environmental groups. Can you speak to the support that you have received from lawyers or law professors who are engaged and see the rights of nature as a way of bringing about a changed approach to environmental justice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we have a group of lawyers that we work with. And then there have been other like we just actually filed a lawsuit. We filed a civil rights lawsuit about a year ago in Ohio about our right to initiative, because they're trying to keep things off the ballot. And the court ruled against us. We called it's a civil rights issue. And we just filed our appeal, and we actually had like Earth Law Center filed an amicus brief, because they see the connection between, you know, the people's right to be able to propose laws, so community rights, and protecting nature, which is really encouraging to see. And yeah, there are, you know, legal groups all over. There's groups, the National Lawyers Guild, a couple of their lawyers are assisting. And so, yeah, I mean, it's hard though, because the legal profession, and I a lot of times say the lawyers are the hardest to convince, because they're taught to follow the law as written. And so if you have, you know, when you follow that through, if you have corporations and that drafting the laws and our legislatures passing those laws, they're taught they have to uphold those laws. And so, yeah, it's very difficult a lot of times to convince lawyers to do work outside the system and outside the legal system. So I would love to get to, you know, law students and talk to them. That's my favorite.
Well, we will definitely be following up on this. I think there's a real interest in seeing what we can do from a number of different angles with this initiative, and we're very appreciative of your work. We also know that CELDF has been involved in the Northern Access Pipeline issues, another one that hits really close to home. So thank you for all of your really hard work, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today. Just a quick mention that tonight at 7, we have the talk by Dina Gilio Whitaker entitled Environmental Justice in Indian Country and Moving Toward a Transformational Land Ethic. So the link to that is in the chat. Please join us if you're able. And again, a big thank you to Tish Odell for all of your hard work and for this presentation today. Thank you so much.
Thanks, and hope I'll see some of you in the future.
Yes.
Thanks a lot.
Count on it. Thank you.
Thanks for everything you're doing. Bye-bye.
Take care. Thanks, everybody. Have a good day.